The flight was about to take off, but one passenger refused to sit down. A woman demanded to change her seat, insisting she couldn't sit next to the man beside her. She thought it was just a simple request, until she found out exactly who he was. And in that moment, everything changed. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new one. The airport was full of movement, with travelers rushing to their gates, the sound of rolling suitcases echoing against the polished floors. Overhead, flight announcements called out last boarding calls, blending into the hum of conversation. In the middle of the crowd, Daniel Whitaker, a sharply dressed black man in his early 40s, stood near the boarding gate, casually checking emails on his phone. His crisp navy suit and polished leather shoes gave him an air of quiet authority. But today, he wasn't here as a CEO, just another passenger traveling for business, keeping a low profile in economy class. A few feet away, Eleanor Montgomery clutched her designer handbag, adjusting the gold bracelet on her wrist as she waited in line. Her tailored dress and silk scarf were carefully chosen to reflect class and status. She always believed that the people around her said a lot about her, and she took pride in surrounding herself with the right kind of company. As the line started to move, she glanced at the passengers around her, subtly evaluating them before stepping forward. The flight attendants stood at the entrance of the aircraft, greeting each traveler with a polite smile. Eleanor barely acknowledged them as she walked through the narrow aisle, her eyes scanning for her seat. As she reached row 14, she came to an abrupt stop. Her expression shifted from neutral to stiff disapproval. Her seat was right next to Daniel. Her fingers tightened around the strap of her handbag as she rechecked her boarding pass, hoping she had read it wrong. But the number was clear: 14B, the seat beside Daniel Whitaker. She hesitated for a moment, then let out a sharp breath before turning toward the nearest flight attendant. "Excuse me," she said, keeping her voice low. "I think there's been a mistake with my seat." The young flight attendant, Megan Carter, gave her a polite smile. "Let me check for you, ma'am." She glanced at the ticket and then at the seat number above the row. "No mistake. This is your assigned seat." Eleanor's expression didn't change. "I'd like a different one." Megan tilted her head slightly. "Unfortunately, ma'am, this is a full flight. All the seats are assigned." Eleanor exhaled, her lips pressing together. "I paid for a comfortable flight, and I think I have a right to ask for a different seat. Surely there's something you can do." Daniel, who had been focused on his tablet, now glanced up. He had been listening, but he chose not to react. He had heard these kinds of conversations before. Different words, same message. Megan remained professional. "I wish I could accommodate you, but there are no open seats." Eleanor glanced down at Daniel, then back at Megan. "You expect me to sit here for the entire flight?" Daniel held her gaze for a brief moment before looking back at his screen. The tension in the air was obvious now, and passengers nearby started to take notice. A man across the aisle, Robert Fields, an executive on a business trip, raised an eyebrow. A younger woman, Lisa Herrera, seated a row ahead, subtly shook her head. Eleanor took a deep breath, as if preparing for an argument. "I just don't feel comfortable sitting here. It's nothing personal, of course." Daniel finally looked at her, a small, unreadable smile forming at the corner of his lips. "It never is." Eleanor blinked, clearly not expecting a response. Before she could say anything else, Megan straightened her posture. "Ma'am, I can inform the senior crew members if you'd like to escalate this." Eleanor crossed her arms. "Yes, I think that would be best." Passengers exchanged glances. Lisa Herrera turned slightly to whisper something to her seatmate. Robert Fields tapped his fingers on his armrest, watching closely. The energy in the cabin had shifted, and Eleanor, still unaware of how this situation would unfold, stood firm in her request. Megan gave a nod. "I'll be right back." As she walked away, Eleanor turned toward Daniel again, this time with a forced, polite smile. "I hope you understand. It's just a matter of preference." Daniel kept his expression neutral. "Of course." His voice was calm, but there was something in his eyes that made Eleanor shift uncomfortably. A few moments later, Megan returned, this time with Thomas Reynolds, the senior flight attendant. He had a firm but composed presence. the kind that suggested he had handled plenty of passenger conflicts before. But what Eleanor didn't realize was that someone even higher up was already aware of the situation, someone who had a personal reason to step in. And as the murmur of whispers grew in the cabin, the atmosphere thick with anticipation, Eleanor had no idea that her request was about to backfire in a way she never expected. The murmur of whispers spread through the cabin as Thomas Reynolds, the senior flight attendant, approached. His composed expression barely hid the quiet frustration in his eyes. Megan Carter stood beside him, watching as Eleanor lifted her chin slightly, prepared to push her request further. "Ma'am, I understand you have a concern about your seat," Thomas said, his voice calm and professional. "Could you clarify exactly what the issue is?" Eleanor glanced at Daniel for the briefest moment before shifting her attention back to Thomas. "I've already explained. I'd prefer to sit somewhere else. It's about my comfort." Daniel, still seated, remained silent, his fingers resting on his tablet. He had seen this play out before. He knew exactly how this conversation would go. Thomas sighed inwardly, but kept his polite demeanor. "As Megan mentioned, we are at full capacity today. There are no other available seats." Eleanor's mouth tightened. "I find that hard to believe. There must be some flexibility. I'd even be willing to pay for an upgrade." Thomas didn't flinch. "We don't have any available upgrades either, ma'am." Eleanor exhaled sharply. "This is unbelievable. I've flown with this airline many times, and I've never had to deal with such an issue. Customer service is supposed to accommodate reasonable requests." Passengers nearby were now openly watching. Robert Fields, the businessman across the aisle, gave an unimpressed shake of his head. Lisa Herrera, the younger woman a row ahead, exchanged a knowing look with her seatmate. Daniel's voice broke through the tension, low and steady. "You keep calling it a request, but it sounds more like a demand." Eleanor snapped her attention to him, her expression shifting slightly. "Excuse me?" Daniel didn't look angry. He didn't even raise his voice. But the weight of his words made Eleanor falter. "You've made it clear that you don't want to sit here. The problem is, I'm not moving, and they've already told you there are no other seats. So what exactly do you expect to happen next?" The directness of the question caught her off guard. She wasn't used to being questioned like this, especially not in public. Thomas took a deep breath and glanced toward Megan. He had been in this industry long enough to know when a situation needed to be handled swiftly. "Ma'am, if you are refusing to take your assigned seat, we may have to involve higher management." Eleanor scoffed. "Yes, that's exactly what I want. Bring someone in charge. I want to speak to the highest authority on this flight." Megan and Thomas exchanged a look. Megan pressed a small button on her intercom, sending a discreet message to the flight deck. Eleanor leaned back slightly, as if she had won this round. She looked away, avoiding Daniel's gaze. What she didn't know, what she hadn't even considered, was that the highest authority on this flight was already sitting right next to her, and she was about to find out in the most humiliating way possible. The low hum of the aircraft engines filled the cabin as passengers exchanged glances, their curiosity growing. Robert Fields shifted in his seat, folding his arms as he watched the scene unfold. Lisa Herrera whispered something to her seatmate, shaking her head. Even those who had been absorbed in their books or devices were now paying attention. The tension had become impossible to ignore. Eleanor, still standing in the aisle, held her posture stiffly, her expression firm with expectation. She had demanded to speak to the highest authority on the flight, confident that someone would finally accommodate her request. She adjusted the gold bracelet on her wrist, preparing herself for a conversation she believed would go in her favor. A few moments later, footsteps approached. The quiet chatter in the cabin faded as a man in uniform stepped into the economy section. He carried himself with authority, his presence immediately commanding attention. Eleanor's expression shifted, her lips curling slightly in satisfaction. Finally, someone who could fix this. The flight attendant, Thomas Reynolds, stepped aside and gestured toward the man. "Ma'am, this is our flight captain, Matthew Collins." Eleanor tilted her chin up slightly. "Captain, thank you for coming. I'm sure you understand my situation. I simply need a different seat." Captain Collins gave her a neutral look before glancing at Thomas. "I was informed that there was an issue with seating. Can you clarify exactly what the problem is?" Eleanor exhaled as if this was exhausting for her. "It's really very simple. I don't feel comfortable in this seat, and I'd like to be moved. Collins looked around the cabin, his expression unreadable. I see. And what exactly is making you uncomfortable? Eleanor's mouth opened slightly, but she hesitated. It was clear she was choosing her words carefully now. She couldn't say what she truly meant, not in front of so many people. Daniel, who had remained quiet until now, finally spoke again, his voice just as calm as before. That's the part she won't say out loud. Eleanor's head turned toward him sharply, but before she could respond, Captain Collins cleared his throat. Ma'am, I need to make this clear. This is a full flight. There are no available seats to move you to. Eleanor's frustration deepened. But surely there must be some way to make an exception. Collins held up a hand, cutting her off. I'm not in the business of making exceptions based on personal preferences. His voice was firm but professional. The murmurs in the cabin grew louder. Passengers were nodding, exchanging knowing glances. Some even smirked, amused by how quickly things were turning against Eleanor. She squared her shoulders, unwilling to back down. Well, if there's truly no other seat available, then maybe I should just take another flight. Lisa Herrera let out a quiet laugh. Robert Fields muttered under his breath. Now that's a solution I'd support. Captain Collins didn't look amused. That is entirely your choice, ma'am. But I will remind you that if you voluntarily deboard, you will have to book another ticket at your own expense. Eleanor's face twitched slightly. That was not the response she had expected. For the first time, doubt flickered in her eyes. She had been so sure that if she pushed hard enough, someone would move her away from him. She had counted on the airline bending to her will, but she had miscalculated. What she still didn't realize was that Daniel Whitaker wasn't just another passenger. He wasn't just some businessman she could dismiss. And soon the truth was about to hit her harder than she could have ever imagined. Eleanor's fingers tightened around the strap of her handbag as she weighed her options. The silence in the cabin was thick. Eyes locked onto her every move. She had been certain that her insistence would lead to a solution, one that suited her preferences. But now, standing before the captain, with the entire flight watching, she felt an unfamiliar sensation creeping in. Unease. Captain Collins remained composed, waiting for her response. So, ma'am, what would you like to do? Eleanor swallowed. She couldn't afford to miss this flight. She had an important engagement waiting for her, and rebooking another flight at her own expense wasn't an option she liked. Still, the thought of sitting in that seat next to him for hours was unbearable. She forced a tight smile. Fine, I suppose I'll just have to deal with it. The tension in the cabin shifted. A few passengers let out quiet chuckles, while others exchanged knowing glances. Lisa Herrera smirked before returning to her book, satisfied that Eleanor wasn't getting her way. Robert Fields simply shook his head, amused by the situation. Captain Collins gave her a nod. Glad to hear it. Now, if you could please take your seat, we can prepare for departure. Eleanor turned stiffly, unwilling to meet Daniel's gaze. With slow, deliberate movements, she lowered herself into her seat, her body rigid with discomfort. Daniel glanced at her briefly before returning to his tablet. His expression remained unreadable, but something about his quiet composure made Eleanor shift in her seat. Thomas Reynolds, the senior flight attendant, leaned in slightly. Thank you for cooperating, ma'am. His voice held the same professional tone, but there was no mistaking the underlying firmness in his words. Eleanor didn't respond. She simply nodded, focusing on adjusting her handbag on her lap, as if that somehow restored her sense of control. As the flight attendants finalized the boarding process, the sound of overhead bins clicking shut and seatbelts being fastened filled the cabin. Passengers settled in, but the lingering awkwardness around Eleanor remained. She kept her gaze forward, determined to ignore the presence beside her. But deep down, she was still fuming. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. Then, just as she thought she had made it past the worst of the situation, she heard something that made her grip her handbag even tighter. A hushed conversation between the flight attendants near the front of the cabin. She caught just enough of their words to understand one chilling fact. Someone very important on this flight had already been informed of what happened, and soon they would be making an appearance. Eleanor's stomach turned. Who could possibly be higher than the captain on this flight? She wasn't ready for the answer. Not at all. Eleanor stared straight ahead, pretending to focus on the in-flight safety instructions. But her mind was racing. Who had been informed? The way the flight attendants whispered to each other, the way the passengers still cast amused glances her way. It all made her uneasy. She shifted in her seat, stealing a glance at Daniel, who remained calm, scrolling through his tablet as if nothing had happened. His lack of reaction irritated her. Did he not care? Was he enjoying this? The thought unsettled her even more. The final boarding announcement came over the speakers. A few last-minute passengers hurried down the aisle, stuffing their bags into the overhead compartments. The flight attendants moved through the rows, checking seatbelts and making final preparations. The cabin settled into a quiet hum, but Eleanor's discomfort only grew. Then something changed, a distinct shift in the energy of the cabin. It started with the sudden movement of one of the flight attendants toward first class, a sense of urgency in their steps. Then the whispers among the crew grew quieter, more focused. Passengers began looking toward the front of the plane. A few sat up straighter, as if sensing something important was about to happen. Eleanor felt her breath catch. Who was coming? She turned slightly, trying to catch a glimpse down the aisle, but her view was blocked by the passengers ahead. All she could hear was the rustling of movement, and then footsteps, steady, deliberate, unhurried. The kind of footsteps that made people take notice. A tall man in an expensive suit stepped into the economy section. He wasn't a flight attendant, nor was he part of the regular crew. There was an unmistakable authority in the way he carried himself, a presence that commanded respect without a single word. Passengers began whispering. Some recognized him immediately. Others simply knew. Whoever he was someone important. Eleanor's throat tightened. The man stopped near the flight attendants, exchanged a few quiet words, then turned his head, his eyes locking directly onto her row. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face, and then, in one smooth movement, Daniel closed his tablet, sat up, and turned to face her. Eleanor blinked, confusion clouding her features as Daniel calmly met her gaze. For the first time since this entire ordeal began, he truly looked at her, not just as another passenger, but as something else entirely. A flicker of recognition crossed Eleanor's face. She turned back toward the approaching man, then back at Daniel. Something was wrong. Something was very, very wrong. The man in the suit stopped beside their row, looking directly at Daniel. Then in a firm but respectful voice, he spoke the words that made Eleanor's world shift beneath her. "Mr. Whitaker, I apologize for the delay. We were just made aware of the situation." Silence. Eleanor's breath hitched. "Mr. Whitaker?" Her mind spun as realization slammed into her like a wave. Daniel Whitaker. She knew that name. Everyone knew that name. Because Daniel Whitaker wasn't just another passenger. He wasn't just some businessman. He was the CEO of the airline. And Eleanor had just spent the last 15 minutes trying to have him removed from his own plane. Eleanor's stomach twisted as the weight of her mistake settled in. Daniel Whitaker, CEO of Whitaker Aviation, the very airline she had been flying with for years. Her fingers trembled slightly against the fabric of her handbag as her mind raced to process what had just happened. The man she had dismissed so easily, the man she had tried to have moved, was the most powerful person on this entire flight. The whispers in the cabin grew louder. Passengers who had been watching the exchange now understood exactly who Daniel was. Some looked stunned, others amused, and a few shook their heads in disbelief at Eleanor's miscalculation. The man in the suit, Richard Vaughn, Whitaker Aviation's head of operations, continued speaking, his voice steady but firm. "Mr. Whitaker, I assure you, the situation is being handled. If you would like us to take further action, we are at your discretion." Daniel exhaled slowly, leaning back into his seat, his fingers resting on the armrest. His expression remained calm, but there was a new sharpness in his gaze as he turned toward Eleanor. She felt her throat dry up. This was the moment when most people would have spoken up, apologized, tried to backtrack. But her words failed her. What could she possibly say? Eleanor sat stiffly, every muscle in her body tense. She could feel the weight of the passengers' stares, the judgment, the amusement. The smug confidence she had carried just minutes ago had completely crumbled. Daniel studied her for a long moment before finally speaking. You wanted to speak to the highest authority on this flight. Here I am." His words hit her like a brick. Eleanor opened her mouth, but nothing came out. A man a few rows back let out a low chuckle. Lisa Herrera smirked, shaking her head. Robert Fields folded his arms, watching with interest. The humiliation was suffocating. Eleanor finally forced out a weak, stammering response. I didn't realize." Daniel's gaze didn't waver. "You didn't realize who I was." His tone remained level, but there was no mistaking the steel behind it. Would it have mattered? Eleanor blinked rapidly, her mind scrambling for an answer. Would it have mattered? Of course it would have. That was the truth. If she had known, she never would have dared to complain. She would have treated him with the same forced politeness she gave to executives and high-profile figures. And now everyone knew it. Daniel turned back to Richard Vaughn. "There's no need for further action," he said, his voice smooth but deliberate. "I think she's already realizing the consequences of her own behavior." Richard gave a small nod. "Understood, sir." Eleanor's pulse pounded in her ears. She wanted to disappear. The passengers were still staring, some in shock, others in satisfaction. She could feel the weight of every single gaze. For years, she had moved through the world assuming she could dictate her surroundings, choosing who she sat beside, who she spoke to, who she acknowledged. But today, she had been forced to face the truth, one she could no longer ignore. And the flight hadn't even taken off yet. Eleanor's hands were ice cold, gripping her handbag as if it were the only thing anchoring her in place. Her heart pounded against her ribs. The entire cabin seemed to shrink around her. She had never felt this exposed before. Daniel turned his attention back to his tablet, as if the situation no longer concerned him. That was somehow worse. If he had yelled, if he had gotten angry, at least she could have responded, defended herself. But his indifference made it clear that her opinion, her discomfort, her entire presence was irrelevant to him. A flight attendant moved past, checking seatbelts. The normalcy of the action felt almost cruel, as if the entire flight hadn't just watched Eleanor humiliate herself in front of the most powerful person on board. Lisa Herrera, seated a row ahead, leaned toward her seatmate and whispered, "I bet she's regretting that now." Her companion chuckled softly. Robert Fields, the businessman across the aisle, gave Eleanor a glance. One that wasn't cruel, but wasn't sympathetic either. It was the look of someone who had seen justice served. Eleanor swallowed hard. She needed to say something. Anything. She turned her head slightly toward Daniel, her voice barely above a whisper. I wasn't trying to offend you." Daniel didn't even look up from his tablet. "You didn't?" he replied smoothly, his tone unreadable. Eleanor opened her mouth, but she couldn't find the right words. How could she explain herself? The flight crew had made it clear there were no other seats. She had no real reason for her request, at least not one she could say out loud. And now everyone around her knew it. She shifted uncomfortably. The seat she had fought so hard to avoid suddenly felt unbearably small. The intercom crackled, and the captain's voice came on. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are now preparing for takeoff. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened." Eleanor forced herself to comply, her fingers fumbling with the belt. The cabin crew moved through the aisles one last time, securing the cabin for departure. The engines rumbled, the plane rolling toward the runway. Eleanor stared at the seat back in front of her, her mind spiraling. How had this happened? How had she let herself get caught in this situation? But deep down, she already knew the answer. And as the plane lifted into the sky, the weight of her choices sat heavier on her shoulders than ever before. As the plane climbed into the sky, Eleanor kept her eyes locked on the seat back in front of her, barely breathing. The hum of the engines, the muffled chatter of passengers, even the gentle tilt of the aircraft as it ascended. All of it faded behind the roar in her head. How had this spiraled so quickly? Just moments ago, she had been convinced that she was in control. She had felt justified, entitled to request another seat. It wasn't a big deal. It was just a matter of preference. At least that's what she had told herself. Now trapped in her seat, she was left to face the truth she had tried so hard to ignore. She had judged him. The moment she had seen Daniel, before he had spoken a single word, she had decided she didn't want to sit next to him. That was the part she couldn't admit, not even to herself. She sneaked a glance at Daniel, who remained calm, scrolling through his tablet as if the entire encounter had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience. His posture was relaxed, his breathing steady, completely unaffected. That stung. He wasn't angry. He wasn't flustered. He didn't even seem insulted. In fact, he had barely acknowledged her since the revelation, because to him, she wasn't even worth the energy of a reaction. And that, somehow, was worse than being called out in front of the entire cabin. She cleared her throat slightly, shifting in her seat. The silence between them was unbearable. But what could she possibly say? For years, Eleanor had carried herself with poise and confidence. She had always believed she was a woman of good manners, someone who knew how to navigate society with grace. She had never thought of herself as prejudiced. She had never said anything outwardly cruel, never caused a scene, until now. Yet here she was, sitting next to a man she had disrespected, with no way to undo the damage. The turbulence hit suddenly, a small jolt that made the cabin rattle for just a second. It wasn't severe, but it was enough to make Eleanor grip the armrest out of instinct. Without hesitation, Daniel calmly removed his hand from his lap and rested it lightly against the armrest between them, just inches from hers. He didn't flinch at the turbulence, didn't even react. It was such a small thing, barely a movement, but it sent a wave of humiliation through her. This was a man who sat in boardrooms, signed million-dollar deals, ran an entire airline. A man who had built the very company she had been so eager to criticize. And here she was, reduced to nothing more than an anxious passenger grasping at control she no longer had. The plane steadied, and Eleanor released her grip, suddenly aware of just how tightly she had been clutching the armrest. Daniel didn't react, didn't smirk, didn't gloat, didn't acknowledge her at all. He simply continued reading, as if she weren't even there. The flight attendants began moving through the aisles offering beverages. Megan, the same flight attendant who had handled Eleanor's complaints earlier, approached with the drink cart. Her eyes flickered toward Eleanor for only a moment before turning to Daniel. "Would you like something to drink, Mr. Whitaker?" she asked, her voice polite, respectful. Mr. Whitaker. Even now, hearing his name addressed with so much authority made Eleanor's stomach churn. She had no idea how badly she had miscalculated. Daniel looked up, offering a small, professional smile. "Just water, please." Megan handed him a bottle, nodding respectfully before turning to Eleanor. Her smile didn't falter, but something about it felt different now. "And for you, ma'am." Eleanor hesitated, suddenly feeling like every set of eyes in the cabin was watching. The weight of her earlier behavior pressed down on her. Water," she said quietly. Megan nodded, handing her the bottle without another word before moving to the next row. Eleanor felt the chill of the plastic bottle in her hands, but her throat was too tight to take a sip. She was trapped here, trapped in a seat she had begged to leave, next to a man she had silently judged, while surrounded by passengers who had seen the entire scene unfold. And the worst part, she wasn't even sure if she regretted being caught more than she regretted the actions that had led her here. Because for the first time in a very long time, Eleanor Montgomery wasn't certain she was the person she had always believed herself to be. Eleanor had never felt time move so slowly. Every second that passed felt like an eternity, stretching the silence between her and Daniel Whitaker into something unbearable. The air in the cabin felt heavier now, though the other passengers had mostly turned their attention back to their own activities. Still, she could feel their judgment lingering, the weight of unspoken thoughts pressing down on her like an invisible force. She twisted the cap off her water bottle and took a small sip, but her throat remained dry. The simple action of drinking felt mechanical, like something to do just to keep her hands from shaking. Daniel remained calm, completely at ease in his seat, occasionally scrolling through his tablet or glancing out the window. It was like she wasn't even there. That more than anything unsettled her. Eleanor wasn't used to feeling insignificant. Her entire life she had been someone who commanded attention, someone who belonged in certain circles. She had built her identity around the idea that she knew what was right, what was proper. And yet here she was, a grown woman reduced to silence because she couldn't even look the man next to her in the eye. She let out a slow breath and tried to focus on something else. Anything else. The seatbelt sign blinked off with a soft chime, and the flight attendants moved freely through the aisle, checking on passengers. The man across the aisle, Robert Fields, had leaned back with his noise-canceling headphones on, flipping through a business magazine. Lisa Herrera and her seatmate, however, still sent occasional glances her way. They weren't even pretending to be subtle. Eleanor's fingers curled in her lap. She hated this feeling. After what felt like an eternity, Daniel finally spoke. Long flight ahead. His voice was low, smooth, completely unbothered. Eleanor's eyes flicked toward him in surprise. He wasn't looking at her, still glancing at his screen, but it was clear his words were meant for her. For the first time, she had no idea how to respond. Should she apologize, laugh it off, ignore it? She shifted in her seat, uncomfortable under the weight of his calmness. This was worse than if he had just yelled at her. She cleared her throat. Yes, it is. Her own voice sounded foreign, too soft, too uncertain. Daniel finally turned his head, meeting her gaze. There was no anger there, no smugness, just observation. That was worse. Eleanor had expected hostility, had expected something sharp or cutting. But instead, Daniel Whitaker just looked at her, his expression unreadable, his posture completely at ease. He wasn't reacting the way she had expected. She braced herself, expecting him to say something else, something scathing, something that would solidify her shame. But he didn't. Instead, he just went back to his tablet, as if the conversation wasn't even worth continuing. Eleanor let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her mind replayed everything over and over. The moment she had stopped at the seat, the way she had waved over the flight attendant, the words that had come out of her mouth, "I just don't feel comfortable sitting here." She knew exactly what she had meant. So did everyone else. She squeezed her eyes shut for a brief moment. How had she let herself be so careless? But the truth, the part that made her stomach twist the most, was that it wasn't carelessness. It was instinct. That was the real problem. She had spoken without thinking, not because she hadn't meant it, but because she had been so certain she was in the right. She had never stopped to consider what it meant. Now, sitting next to the very man she had dismissed, she was forced to. The flight attendant, Megan Carter, passed by again, offering refreshments. As she approached their row, her polite smile never wavered. But there was something different in her eyes when she looked at Eleanor. A slight hesitation, a shift. Eleanor knew what it meant. People saw her differently now. For years, she had carefully curated her reputation. She had been respected, admired in her social circles. But reputation wasn't built on a single moment. It was built on perception. And she had changed how people saw her in an instant. It didn't matter that they were strangers. It mattered that, deep down, she knew they were right. The realization sat like a heavy stone in her stomach. Eleanor swallowed hard, staring out the window as the plane soared higher into the sky. For the first time in her life, she wasn't sure who she really was. Eleanor stared blankly out of the small airplane window, watching the endless stretch of clouds below. The vast sky was calm, steady, indifferent, so unlike the storm inside her. The weight of silence between her and Daniel Whitaker had settled into something suffocating, something that pressed against her chest like a heavy stone. She had spent years perfecting her ability to navigate social situations, to control the way people perceived her. Yet for the first time, she had no control over how someone saw her. Or worse, she had no way to undo it. Daniel's posture hadn't changed. He remained relaxed, occasionally shifting in his seat, scrolling through whatever was on his tablet. He hadn't spoken to her again. He hadn't acknowledged her presence. That fact alone sent a cold wave of humiliation through Eleanor's body. She had spent the last 15 minutes trying to figure out how to fix this, how to salvage what had been ruined. But how? How do you apologize for something you didn't even realize you were guilty of until it was too late? No, that wasn't right. She had realized it. The moment she had heard his name, Daniel Whitaker, the CEO of the very airline she had demanded accommodation from. Her stomach twisted. Would she have acted differently if she had known? Of course she would have. That thought made her feel even worse. Eleanor had always thought of herself as someone who treated people with respect. She wasn't like that. Not like the people on the news who made a scene, who got caught on camera saying the unspeakable. But wasn't she? Wasn't this exactly what that was? She hadn't shouted. She hadn't used crude language. But she had done something worse. She had judged him before he even had a chance to prove her wrong. And now she was trapped here, forced to sit with that truth for the next few hours. The flight attendant, Megan Carter, moved down the aisle again, this time passing out meal trays. When she stopped at their row, she offered Daniel a warm smile, her voice perfectly respectful. "Mr. Whitaker, would you like the chicken or the pasta?" Mr. Whitaker. Even now, hearing him addressed with so much deference made Eleanor's face burn. Daniel barely glanced up. "Pasta, please." Megan handed him the tray, nodding. Then she turned to Eleanor, her polite expression unchanged, but somehow different. There was no visible hostility, no outright disdain. But Eleanor felt it. Megan saw her differently now, and that stung in a way she hadn't expected. "Ma'am," Megan said, her voice still professional, "chicken or pasta?" Eleanor hesitated, suddenly aware of how insignificant this choice was compared to everything else. She forced her voice to remain steady. "Pasta, please." Megan handed her the tray without another word before moving to the next row. Eleanor exhaled slowly, gripping the edges of her meal tray. She had never been on this side of judgment before. She had spent years being the woman who got what she wanted, the woman who didn't have to explain herself. Now she was the woman everyone was whispering about. She picked at the food absent-mindedly, her appetite completely gone. Across the aisle, Robert Fields stole a glance at her before shaking his head, focusing back on his work. A row ahead, Lisa Herrera exchanged another knowing look with her seatmate. Eleanor wasn't sure why, but their silent judgment hurt more than if they had outright confronted her. Because deep down, she knew they weren't wrong. She cleared her throat, glancing at Daniel again. He had already started eating, completely unbothered, his focus on his tablet once more. The longer she sat beside him, the clearer something became. She wasn't the victim here. Daniel hadn't lost anything from this encounter. She had. He had gone back to his routine. She was the one left drowning in the aftermath. She placed her fork down, exhaling through her nose. She needed to say something, not because she wanted to repair her image, not because she was embarrassed, but because for the first time, she actually felt guilty. But where did she even begin? She shifted slightly in her seat. "Mr. Whitaker?" Daniel didn't react right away. He took his time chewing, swallowing, before finally turning his head to look at her. His expression gave away nothing. Eleanor licked her lips, suddenly feeling like the air had thinned. She hadn't thought this through. What was she even going to say? "I didn't mean it? That wasn't true. I'm not like that?" Clearly she was. "I'm sorry." That was the only option. But even now it felt small compared to what had already been done. Still, she forced herself to say it. I'm sorry for earlier." Daniel watched her, his face unreadable. The seconds stretched painfully long. Then he simply nodded. "Okay." That was it. No anger, no lecture, no drawn-out moment of reflection. Just acceptance. And somehow that made it worse. Eleanor had expected something more. A reaction, maybe even a dismissal. But instead, Daniel Whitaker had moved on. He had already decided she wasn't worth his time. She looked down at her tray, her appetite completely gone. For the first time in her life, Eleanor Montgomery had to sit with the realization that she had made a mistake. One that wouldn't just be forgotten when the flight landed. Because no matter how much she wanted to pretend otherwise, she would remember this moment for the rest of her life. Eleanor stared at the untouched food on her tray, her mind clouded with thoughts she couldn't escape. The hum of the engines and the occasional clinking of utensils filled the cabin, but all she could hear was the single word Daniel had spoken. "Okay. Not I accept your apology. Not I understand. Just, okay." She knew exactly what that meant. It meant nothing. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't even acknowledgement. It was dismissal. And somehow that cut deeper than anything else. Eleanor had never been ignored before. Not in this way. She had spent her life in circles where people listened when she spoke, where her words held weight. But now, sitting next to Daniel Whitaker, she had never felt more insignificant. She had tried to apologize, expecting it to somehow lessen the discomfort she felt, but instead it only made it worse. Because it wasn't just about the apology. It was about why she had needed to apologize in the first place. She forced herself to pick up her fork, pushing the pasta around the tray, not actually eating. The meal, the flight, the entire situation felt endless. Every now and then, she caught movement out of the corner of her eye. Other passengers still looking her way. Lisa Herrera, seated in front, whispered something to her seatmate. Robert Fields gave a knowing glance in her direction before turning back to his work. Even the flight attendants, though polite, no longer looked at her the same way. Eleanor clenched her jaw, heat rising in her cheeks. Would this ever go away? Even after the flight landed, even after she walked off this plane, would this moment follow her? She imagined it now, the way people would tell the story. Some woman on my flight made a scene because she didn't want to sit next to a black man. And guess what? He turned out to be the CEO of the airline. She could already hear the way they'd say it, the judgment, the mocking tone. She wasn't used to being on this side of a story. She had always been the one who made the judgment, not the one being judged. Eleanor's fingers tightened around her fork. It wasn't fair. She wasn't a bad person. She hadn't meant anything by it. It wasn't like she had said anything hateful. But then again, had she needed to? Hadn't her actions said enough? The moment she saw Daniel, she had assumed she wouldn't be comfortable, assumed she was entitled to another seat, assumed that he was the one who didn't belong next to her. And now here she was, trapped in the consequences of those assumptions. She let out a slow breath, forcing herself to relax her grip on the fork. Then something happened that made her stomach twist even further. A passenger from first class was walking down the aisle, headed straight for them. At first, Eleanor thought it was just someone stretching their legs, but then she noticed how the flight attendants straightened their postures, how their eyes flickered toward Daniel with silent recognition. And that's when it hit her. Whoever this was, they weren't just another passenger. The man, a tall, well-dressed figure in a dark blue suit, stopped right beside their row. He wasn't as polished as Daniel, his tie slightly loosened, but he carried an air of familiarity. He leaned slightly toward Daniel and spoke in a low voice, but Eleanor still heard every word. "I heard there was a situation?" Eleanor's stomach dropped. Daniel, still composed, nodded once. "Handled." The man's lips twitched as if suppressing a smirk, but his expression quickly returned to something unreadable. He flicked his eyes toward Eleanor, and in that second, she knew he had already heard everything. Her face burned. Daniel didn't say anything else, didn't even acknowledge the man's presence beyond that single nod. It was as if the entire ordeal had been so beneath his concern that it wasn't even worth discussing, and somehow that was worse than if he had made a scene. Eleanor wished she could shrink into her seat. The man, whoever he was, gave one last glance between them before nodding slightly. "Good." Then just as quickly as he had arrived, he turned and walked back to first class. Eleanor exhaled, but the relief was short-lived, because the moment she looked up, she saw Lisa Herrera's knowing smirk. She turned her gaze away quickly, but it was too late. They all knew. They all knew that she was the woman who had made a fool of herself. And no matter what happened for the rest of this flight, she couldn't escape that. The walls of the aircraft suddenly felt too small, too confined, as if she were trapped in a space she had built for herself. For the first time in her life, she was on the other side of judgment. And the worst part, she deserved every second of it. The hum of the engines filled the silence between them, steady and relentless. Eleanor wished the sound could drown out everything else. The stares, the whispers, the weight of her own thoughts pressing down on her like a storm cloud she couldn't escape. Her breathing was shallow, her posture stiff. She wasn't just uncomfortable in her seat anymore. She was uncomfortable in her own skin. Daniel hadn't looked at her since their last exchange. He sat composed, unaffected, as if nothing that had happened between them mattered at all. That, more than anything, sent a sinking feeling through her chest. Because she realized something. She didn't matter to him. The man she had silently judged, the man she had assumed wasn't on the same level as her, didn't even think about her now. She had insulted him. She had tried to remove him from his seat as if he were an inconvenience. And yet, he wasn't the one who had lost anything. She was. Eleanor had spent years perfecting how people saw her. She knew how to dress, how to talk, how to command a room. She had built a reputation as a woman of refinement, someone who knew how to handle herself in any situation. And now she was the woman people were talking about in whispers. Did you hear? That lady tried to get a new seat just because of who was next to her. And he was the CEO. Can you imagine? She must feel so stupid. She could feel their judgment without even needing to hear the words. And the worst part? She wasn't sure they were wrong. She reached for her water bottle, her hand trembling slightly. She took a small sip, but it didn't help the dryness in her throat. She could still see Lisa Herrera smirking from a few rows ahead, occasionally glancing back at her as if waiting for her to break. Robert Fields was more discreet, but his lack of interest in engaging with her at all spoke volumes. He had already made up his mind about her. And Daniel? Daniel had already moved on. That fact clawed at her more than she wanted to admit, because if he had been the one humiliated, if he had been the one exposed in front of everyone, Eleanor would have relished in it. She would have watched. But he wasn't like her. He didn't need revenge, because he had power. Not just the power of his position as CEO, the power of knowing who he was. Eleanor had spent her entire life defining herself by what people thought of her. Daniel Whitaker? He didn't care, and that was something she couldn't handle. She let out a shaky breath, barely able to hold herself together. The reality of everything was suffocating her. She had spent her entire life believing she was different. She had always told herself she wasn't like the people she read about, the people caught on viral videos or called out for their behavior. But today she had been that person. Her thoughts spiraled, trying to grab onto any excuse that could justify what she had done. I didn't mean any harm. I was just uncomfortable. It wasn't personal, but it was personal. She had looked at Daniel Whitaker, a man she knew nothing about, and had decided she didn't want to sit next to him. She had assumed he was beneath her. She had assumed he was the problem, and now she was the only one sitting in her own discomfort. Her hands clenched into fists in her lap. For the first time in her life, she had to acknowledge that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as good of a person as she had always believed. She had always seen herself as polite, proper, a woman of class. But what did that mean if her first instinct, the moment she was slightly uncomfortable, was to act like this? What did that say about her? The truth was an ugly, painful thing. Eleanor Montgomery had spent years convincing herself she was better than others, when in reality, she had just never been challenged. Until now. She felt her stomach twist, the shame thicken her throat. For the first time since boarding the plane, she wished she could disappear, not because people were staring, not because she had been caught, but because, deep down, she finally saw herself the way everyone else did. And she hated what she saw. Eleanor shifted in her seat, her body stiff with tension. She had never felt smaller in her life. The cabin around her, once a place of comfort and familiarity, now felt like a prison, trapping her with nothing but her own thoughts and the consequences of her actions. She could feel the weight of every passenger's gaze, even if they weren't looking at her directly. The whispers had faded, but the judgment remained. It clung to her skin like a cold sweat, an invisible mark she couldn't scrub away. Daniel, seated beside her, hadn't spoken again. He hadn't needed to. His silence was enough. He was the one who had been wronged, yet he sat there, calm, composed, untouched by the embarrassment she was drowning in. Eleanor clenched her hands together in her lap, staring blankly at the meal tray in front of her. The food was cold now, untouched. She couldn't eat. She couldn't even pretend to be okay. Her mind replayed every moment from the beginning. The way she had paused at the seat, the way she had immediately assumed she didn't belong next to him, the way she had demanded to be moved as if her discomfort mattered more than his dignity. She had done it without thinking, without hesitation, as if it were her right. Now she couldn't escape the truth. It hadn't been about comfort, it had been about judgment. And for the first time in her life, she had to face the fact that she had been the problem. She exhaled shakily, forcing herself to sit up straighter. She had to fix this. But how? What could she possibly say that would undo everything? "I'm sorry" hadn't been enough. Daniel had accepted her apology, but he hadn't forgiven her. That much was clear. His indifference was more painful than any anger he could have shown her. Because anger meant you were worth a reaction. Indifference meant you weren't even worth thinking about. She turned slightly, stealing a glance at him. His face was unreadable, his eyes focused on his tablet. Did she even deserve a second chance? She swallowed down the lump in her throat, feeling the crushing weight of her own reflection. Her entire life, Eleanor had been careful. Careful with her words. Careful with her image. Careful not to be the person that people whispered about behind their hands. But she hadn't been careful today. She had been careless, thoughtless, cruel. And now she was paying the price. She had been so certain she was different, that she was better than the kind of people who acted out of prejudice. But wasn't that the worst kind of ignorance? To think yourself above it when in reality, it had always been inside you? Her throat burned. She thought about what she would say when the flight landed. Would she walk off in silence? Would she try again to fix things, to say something that mattered? Would it even matter at all? For Daniel Whitaker, this was just another flight, another routine trip, another encounter with someone who judged him before knowing him. It had probably happened to him before. That made Eleanor feel even worse, because that meant she wasn't the first, and if she didn't change, she wouldn't be the last. She inhaled deeply, feeling the weight of her own realization settle in her chest. She had spent her whole life avoiding discomfort, but now she was finally learning something. Maybe discomfort wasn't the problem. Maybe it was the beginning of understanding. For the first time in her life, Eleanor didn't want to run from it. She wanted to sit with it. She wanted to be better, not just for Daniel Whitaker, but for herself. Eleanor had never been one to dwell on things. She was the kind of person who moved on, brushed off discomfort, and carried herself with unshaken confidence. But not today. Today she felt like a different person. Or maybe, just maybe, she was finally seeing herself for who she had always been. The realization was unsettling. She wasn't a stranger to self-reflection, but she had always done it in a way that reassured her of her own righteousness. She had always found a way to justify her actions, to convince herself that she was never truly in the wrong. But there was no justifying this. She glanced down at her hands, now clenched in her lap. They felt different, not physically, but in a way she couldn't explain. Like they had touched something they weren't supposed to, left fingerprints where they shouldn't have. For so long, she had believed that respect was something earned, something that had to be proven. But Daniel Whitaker had done nothing to her. Nothing. And yet she had judged him anyway. Her stomach twisted. She had thought that once the flight took off, once people stopped whispering, once Daniel ignored her, she would be able to sit in quiet regret and wait for it to pass. But it wasn't passing. It was sitting with her, clinging to her skin like something permanent. She thought about the things she would normally do to make herself feel better. Would she tell herself that it wasn't a big deal, that she was overthinking, that this was just a misunderstanding? But no, this wasn't something she could explain away. She had seen the way the flight attendants had looked at her. She had seen the way Daniel had looked at her. Or worse, the way he hadn't. She took a deep breath, trying to force herself into composure. Maybe she could let it go. Maybe she could pretend it had never happened, walk off this plane and return to her life as if today had been nothing more than a temporary lapse in judgment. But something inside her whispered that she would never truly forget this, because now she knew the truth. She wasn't who she thought she was. For years, she had believed she was a woman of grace, of refinement. She had prided herself on good manners, on knowing how to behave. But today had shown her the truth. It was easy to be polite when you were never forced to question yourself. And that's what this moment was, a reckoning. Eleanor closed her eyes for a second, letting herself feel the weight of it. The plane rattled slightly with turbulence, a reminder that she was still here, still trapped in the moment she had created. She thought about Daniel. Had he felt this way before? Had he sat on flights like this, next to people like her, who had made silent decisions about him without even realizing what they were doing? Of course he had. That's why this wasn't affecting him, because he had already accepted the world for what it was. But Eleanor? She was only now realizing that the world wasn't what she had thought it to be, or maybe it had been all along, and she was just now waking up to it. The thought sent a deep, aching shame through her. She didn't want to be this person. She didn't want to be someone who judged before knowing, someone who assumed she had the right to dictate who belonged where. But she had been. And now she had to decide if that's who she was going to stay. The thought terrified her. She looked at Daniel again, studying his posture, his ease. He hadn't had to change. He hadn't needed to prove anything, because he already knew who he was. Eleanor didn't. Not anymore. And that, more than the judgment, more than the embarrassment, more than the whispers, was what truly scared her. For the first time in her life, she didn't recognize herself. And she wasn't sure if she ever would again. The plane cruised steadily above the clouds, an endless stretch of sky stretching in every direction. The world below was invisible, distant, as if nothing existed beyond the moment inside the cabin. For everyone else on this flight, time was moving forward. Conversations resumed, drinks were poured, screens flickered with in-flight movies. The flight attendants moved through the aisles with routine efficiency, offering refills and clearing trays. But for Eleanor, time had stopped. She sat frozen, locked inside the consequences of her own choices, replaying them over and over again. She had always seen herself as a woman of class, of refinement, of high standards, but today for the first time she saw herself through the eyes of everyone else, and she didn't like what she saw. Her thoughts were a tangled mess: regret, shame, discomfort. She had been trying to figure out a way to undo what had happened, but she knew the truth. Some things couldn't be undone. She had revealed something about herself today, and no matter how much she wanted to rewrite it, explain it away, justify it, she couldn't. She had shown who she really was when she thought no one important was watching, and now she had to live with that. Daniel had moved on. She could see it in the way he sat, completely unbothered, continuing with his work as if she weren't even there. That stung the most. She had spent so much time worrying about how she was perceived, how she carried herself, how people spoke about her behind closed doors. And now here she was, completely insignificant in the eyes of the man she had tried to dismiss. She had wanted to matter. Instead, she had become a footnote in someone else's day, a story to be told over dinner. "You won't believe what happened on my flight today. Some woman tried to change seats because she didn't want to sit next to the CEO of the airline." And that was all she would ever be to these people, a lesson in irony. The flight began its slow descent, and an announcement came over the speakers, instructing passengers to prepare for landing. Eleanor forced herself to sit up, adjusting the silk scarf around her neck, trying to cling to the last remnants of dignity she had left. But no matter how straight she sat, no matter how carefully she composed her expression, it didn't change the truth. She wasn't the same person who had boarded this flight. She didn't know who she was now, and maybe that was the worst part. The attendants moved through the cabin one last time, ensuring seatbelts were fastened. She barely noticed them. Her fingers curled around the armrests as the plane made contact with the runway, the wheels screeching against the pavement. A few passengers braced themselves, gripping their seats. Daniel, of course, remained completely relaxed. Eleanor exhaled shakily, her heart pounding as the aircraft slowed. The moment she had been waiting for was finally here. The flight was over. She could leave. And yet, there was no relief. The moment the seatbelt sign blinked off, the usual chaos of landing began. Overhead, bins clicked open. Passengers shifted in their seats. The flight attendants began thanking people for flying with them. Eleanor felt her pulse quicken. She wanted to be the first off this plane. She wanted to escape before she had to make eye contact with anyone. She reached for her handbag, standing as quickly as she could. And then, she froze, because Daniel wasn't in a rush. He sat there completely unrushed, watching as people squeezed past each other to get to the aisle. And that's when she realized he was waiting, not for the flight attendants, not for the crowd to thin out, for her. Eleanor felt her hands shake as she adjusted the strap of her bag. Then finally Daniel spoke, his voice calm even. "You've been thinking about it this whole flight, haven't you?" She felt her throat tighten. He wasn't angry. He wasn't mocking. He was just stating a fact, and she hated that he was right. She swallowed. Yes. Daniel nodded slightly, as if he had already known the answer. Good. That was all he said, nothing more. And yet, it said everything. Eleanor didn't move at first. She didn't know how to. Then, as if breaking out of a trance, she stepped into the aisle, forcing herself forward, her legs unsteady as she followed the line of passengers making their way toward the exit. She wanted to disappear into the crowd, to fade into anonymity, but deep down she knew she never would. Because this moment, this feeling, would never leave her. It would follow her off the plane. It would stay with her long after she left the airport. And maybe that was exactly what she needed, because for the first time in her life, she had learned something about herself. And the only question that remained was, what would she do with that knowledge now? If this story made you think, let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories like this. Your support helps us bring more eye-opening content your way.